Freedom, huh? That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how we move from that sense of bondage into freedom. What is that journey? And, it is spring, yes? Spring equinox is happening, and Easter, and Passover, and all of this feels like a time of renewal and regeneration and regrowth and rebirth and all of that yummy stuff. And there's this idea around spring that it becomes all about like bunnies and butterflies. And I don't know about you, but I was checking in with someone this morning, and she shared the deepest piece of wisdom with me. She said, "The currents of the ocean are deep." And I thought, oh yeah, they are. Anybody else relate to that right now? That while all of this renewal might be happening, we're in this space that's very liminal. Literally temperature-wise, we go from 40 degrees in the morning to 75 degrees in the afternoon. It's like, where are we actually? So in this place, this space of renewal and rebirth, I love to anchor myself during this time of year in the story of Passover. And the Passover story is a story about liberation. It is the story of the movement from bondage to slavery. It's also the holiday that Jesus was in the midst of, that we are going to be celebrating during Easter. So the Last Supper is pretty much agreed that was a Passover Seder that Jesus was at, it was a Passover Seder. And for me, combining my Jewish heritage along with my unity consciousness it's transformative, because this is actually what Jesus was doing. Jesus was taking his Jewish heritage and he was transforming a teaching and bringing it into an awareness that he was the divine. He was up-leveling something. And so for me, coming back to where he lived, to what anchored him, I find to be personally very revealing, and that it creates a stepping stone to be able to center ourselves in this time of year so that I'm ready for Easter. And there's a lot of similarities here. So what I'm going to be talking about today directly can be related to the rolling away of the stone. That this is the same idea of how do we move away from the things that tie us down, the fears that hold us back, all the ways that we are somehow feeling as if those deep currents that are strong beneath us are somehow going to pull us under. What if they're not actually going to pull us under? What if they are actually going to help us move to a completely different level of consciousness? I was teaching yesterday the affirmative prayer class, and I was saying how the ego does not understand transformation. The ego only sees it as annihilation. And that is where a lot of our fear comes from, is because we think that somehow, some essential part of who we are in the midst of our transformation, butterflies and bunnies, that we are going to somehow be annihilated. And in some ways, we are. But in some ways, it's actually the truth of who we are that is being invited to reveal itself more fully. So what is dying away is the false sense of who we think we are. That's what's actually being invited to die away. So the story of Passover, if you have seen the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, is that what's behind me? Thank you. Right? If you have seen this movie, then you know the story of Passover. How many people in here have seen this movie? Oh, yeah. Okay. So it's one of those, it's like West Side Story, right? It almost doesn't matter what your heritage is. You somehow, this story has been around and this particular movie has been around for so long that we all can resonate with what this story is. And one of the pieces about Passover is that we are invited each year to retell the story as if we each have come forth from Egypt. Now you can put that slide up. My wife is running PowerPoint for me. Right? That each of us, each year, are being invited to retell this story as if we personally have come forth from Egypt. And why I love this is because it's inviting us into a process. It's inviting us into the recognition that these patterns of being disempowered, these patterns of feeling as if something is being done to us, these patterns of feeling as if we somehow cannot have an impact on our own life or on the world, that these patterns are something that we are invited to examine and to explore year after year after year, because we're never done experiencing more freedom. We are divine beings. We are infinite in our expression, which means that the amount of freedom that's available to us is infinite. So in the retelling and in the story of Passover, Egypt in Hebrew is described as Mitzrayim. Everybody say that. Mitzrayim, right? Oops, sorry. Mitzrayim. And what that translates into is a narrow, constricted place. Can anybody relate to that? Feeling as if you're in a narrow and constricted place? That is something that you personally are having to navigate. And it is about, in Unity's understanding, we are talking about all the ways that you are limiting yourself. Based on whatever story, whatever history, whatever events have happened in your life, and some of those events, let me tell you, can be so traumatic, and they can leave deep and powerful wounds in who we understand ourselves to be. And what we know and believe in this teaching, and it was in our core values, that we believe in the power of healing. We believe in the power that we have to be able to transcend the wounds of our childhood, to transcend the wounds of human race consciousness. And that we, as we do that for ourselves, we also are doing that for the world, because we're not separate. There is only one power, one presence, one life. So what is your Mitzrayim? What is the thing that is the narrow place for you? What is the space and place where you're somehow not able to hold on to the truth of your being? For me right now, it has been with my body temple. I know I've been sharing with some of you that I've been having all kinds of hip issues. And, the reason why I wear these shoes every Sunday is because I can't wear heels anymore, right? That's just not physically possible at this moment. And I have found myself coming up against what I see to be a limitation, and I can feel that it wants to overwhelm my awareness of my own wholeness. So I have become enslaved to something that I am experiencing. And that's not what we understand and know to be true in Unity. In Unity, we understand that we have the capacity to create our experience. That's the truth of who we are. And as I have begun to shift my consciousness around what's going on with my body, I'm able to actually walk again. I'm actually able to get out in the world in a way that 3 months ago I could not do. I was in chronic pain, you guys, right? And this is how we move from bondage to freedom, from what are the things that are holding you back. The reading that Momo did for us. What are the ways that fear is keeping you from stepping out into who you have truly called to be? What is your Mitzrayim? Now, in the story of Passover, Moses was raised, he was born an Israelite, but because the Pharaoh in fear is a big theme of the Passover story. In fear, the Pharaoh has decided that they're going to kill all the firstborn children because there was a prophecy that a child would be born that would free the Israelites. Now, the way we understand these kinds of stories in Unity is that all of that is happening within us. So we are Pharaoh, we are Moses, we are the Israelites themselves. All of that lives within us. So in the story of Passover, Pharaoh, from a metaphysical perspective, stands for the status quo. Pharaoh is the one who is maintaining the thing that is right now. Very concerned about what's happening in the material world, building pyramids, right? That's all Egypt is involved in right now. And that part of us is very alive. At least I know it's alive in me. The part of me that wants to keep everything like I know what it is. I can measure it. I can explain it. And then we have the Israelites, which is that part of ourselves that has become enslaved to this idea that this is the only way to live, that this is the only way that I am allowed to express in time and in space. Now, the Israelites didn't come to Egypt as slaves. The Israelites came to Egypt as partners. Remember Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? You guys know that story? So Joseph showed up in Egypt, and there was a famine coming, and Joseph was able to prophesy the famine, and so Egypt was able to save its stores so that when the famine came, they had more than enough. And so Joseph was the Pharaoh's right-hand man. And all these Israelites came into Egypt because it was a place of opportunity. And then over time, that opportunity became enslavement. Can anybody in here relate to that? That you started out doing something in your life that felt like an opportunity, that felt like it was a place where you were going to have new beginnings, and then all of a sudden you find yourself chained to something that no longer fulfills you, that actually makes you feel as if the world is against you. So this is what is happening for the Israelites, which is what's happening within us. So Moses ends up getting exiled because they figure out that he was an Israelite, and so they kick him out of Egypt, and he wanders in the desert. There's a lot of wandering in the desert in the Passover story. Let me just say that. And metaphorically, wandering in the desert means that we're spending time with what we don't know. Has anybody in here experienced that? Where everything that's familiar all of a sudden is gone. Perhaps you've moved, it's a new job, perhaps there's been a tragedy, a death, a physical illness. All of a sudden, the landscape becomes barren. We read about this in Finding Yourself in Transition when we did the book study, right? Sometimes it's described as being in the void, where all the familiar landmarks are gone. And the gift of the void means that the status quo, there's no Pharaoh anymore. There's no status quo. So there's something new that can arise out of that. And for Moses, what that is that arises is he finds himself in a settlement, and he's starting to make new connections, and he climbs to a mountaintop. Again, there's lots of mountaintops in the story of Passover, because we are talking about raising consciousness. So Moses is that part of ourselves that is elevating its consciousness by coming here, by sitting in meditation, by engaging in spiritual practices. And in that process, all of a sudden, the burning bush appears to Moses. And the burning bush says, I am that I am. This is where we get the I amness, you guys. It's the story of Passover that actually launches us into I am consciousness. So Moses is that part of us that is capable of up-leveling our consciousness so that we understand the I am that we actually are. And from that place of consciousness, he hears, let my people go. Let my people go. Let all of the aspects of who you are, free them. Break open this idea that somehow the story that you're caught up in about being enslaved to anything has any value. And Moses said, like most of us would, whoa, wait a minute. I can't do that. I'm just little old me. In fact, I even have a speech impediment. You want me to go? And the divine that Moses is says, yep, it's you. Has anybody in here felt that? where you know that something is yours to do, and yet you have no idea how you're possibly going to be able to do it, and you feel as if it couldn't happen? That's because the small you actually can't make it happen. It's the divinity that you are that is being called to show up. So Moses goes back to Egypt. He goes back. So leaving that elevated consciousness, he goes back into the everyday, right? What we do all the time as we come out of meditation, all of a sudden we're in the everyday. And in that space, he is changed because he's had an experience. The I am that he is awakened. It's alive within him. So he doesn't navigate what was in Egypt in the same way anymore. He shows up in Egypt and says, let my people go, and is able to perform a series of quote-unquote miracles because he is empowered in a different way. Has anybody in here felt that? Where all of a sudden you're able to show up in the world and you're like, where did that come from? How was that? I did that. Wow, I actually did that. That's Moses in this entire interchange with Pharaoh. And every time Pharaoh says no, Moses has to stand in his I amness a little bit more until Moses finally says, enough. And Pharaoh's heart is changed. Your heart is being invited to change. The hardening of your own heart against the call of your divine nature, that is not actually working for your greatest good. The hardening of your heart out of fear, out of doubt, out of the not knowing what could possibly, everything in Egypt is going to change if there's no more Israelites to do all the work. The entire structure is being invited to be reimagined. And so Pharaoh's heart finally softens. And he says, okay, get out of here. You're free, go. And the Israelites are freaking out. They're like, really? Really? I don't know, really? Okay, we're sure? Are we sure about this? How many people have felt that? Where you step out and you're like, oh, I don't know, is this real? It might be real. Maybe it feels like it could be real, but I'm not so sure if it's real. Because the old patterns of who we think we are want to reemerge within us. And so the Israelites pack everything up. They don't even have time to wait for the bread to rise, which is why we eat matzah for 8 days, is because there's no time. There's a sense of urgency. There's an awareness that, something new is calling me and we have to do it now. So there's still some fear. Can you feel that? There's still some fear that somehow someone is still going to do something to them to take away their spiritual authority, to take away your capacity to be able to choose and to navigate what it is that you are going to experience in this world. And the Israelites find themselves, Moses with Miriam leading the way with her timbrel and her song, lead them right to the Red Sea. Seems to be an implacable obstacle. So that sense of showing up in a new way, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I have no idea how I'm going to get past that because it's so huge. It's so mammoth. There is no way for me to be able to do this. And in that moment, the Israelites start freaking out. And we know that feeling too. And they're like, why'd you do this? Why did we do this? I can't believe we did this. Now we're in more trouble than we were before. If we just stayed where we were, at least we knew what was happening. I mean, there's a whole thing that happens within each of us. And so in that moment, the Lord says, why do you cry out to me? I love this part of Scripture. The Israelites are crying out, God, save us, rescue us, please. And God says, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Move on, folks. What would it be like if you were able to truly let go and move on? To let go of all the baggage that you're carrying, to let go of all the stuff that you seem to think that you need to keep with you, even as you're trying to reimagine and recreate a new life. Tell the Israelites to move on. And then he says to Moses, And as for you, I love this. Lift up your staff and extend your hand and divide the sea. Stop asking me to do this for you. You have everything you need. Lift up your hand, extend your staff, and divide it. Do it. Make it happen. Right? That is what we know and believe in unity, that we have the capacity when we own it, when we stand in it, when we don't whiffle waffle, when we actually say, okay, I am doing this. And in that moment, a seeming miracle happens. But it's not a miracle in the sense that it's unattainable. It's a miracle because through the power of the I am, anything is possible. And so in that moment, the Red Sea parts. Whew. And the Israelites move through the Red Sea. And then Pharaoh's men do pursue them. We have that part, right? With the fear and the, oh no, we got to go back to the way it was. And the Red Sea closes down. And that threat, that idea that there's something pursuing us is gone, eliminated. Feels good, right? Much celebrating, woohoo! And in that moment, you would think that with that kind of demonstration, that the Israelites would be like, cool, this is great, we're on the right track. But no, because that is not how we operate. So Moses, the part of us that is our elevated self, once again goes up to a mountaintop. So that in meditation, in that place of discernment, and all the Israelites gather around and they start freaking out again. That one miracle, two huge miracles, right? Actually out of Egypt, actually past the impossible barrier is still not enough to prove to them that they deserve something more. And so they build a false idol to who they used to be. They once again turn from what is calling them forward and revert back to something that was familiar, to something that wasn't even really theirs, but it feels safe. I can relate to that. That idea that in those moments of, I really am being invited to transform, that my egoic sense of personality grasps on and says, oh no, this is too scary. This is too much. Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments. We all remember that from the throwing of the stones and all of that. And Moses, that higher self, and I personally believe that this moment is why Moses isn't allowed to enter the promised land at the end of this. Because Moses doesn't greet those parts of himself that are freaking out with compassion. He meets those parts of himself with anger, with vengeance. He meets those parts of himself with negativity, with punishment. And what happens in that moment is that is when the Israelites are then commanded to wander in the desert for 40 years. And it's literally so that every single one of the Israelites who had experienced slavery firsthand will die off. That is why they wander for 40 years. So that who is left to move forward into the promised land is an entirely new generation that does not have firsthand experience of what slavery is like. Now, this is what's happening in your own consciousness. All those thoughts that you have that are connected to the old understanding of who you thought you were, they have to die away. They have to fall away so that a new understanding can make itself known. And those Israelites are stubborn because even when they're wandering in the desert, they're like, how are we going to have food? And finally, Moses is like, here's manna. You would think that would be amazing. Every morning you wake up and there's food on the ground for you. But no, that's not enough. They still need water. They just don't want to let go of the victim consciousness. But we have more awareness because we're whole. We're a wholeness. So our invitation always is that we step out past the murmuring, right? The murmuring of those voices that are trying to undermine whatever it is that we know is ours to do and ours to be. We need to know that the murmuring is just that, murmuring. It's not real. It is the leftover vestiges of an old consciousness, and that we can consciously choose to enter into the desert ourselves. So what are your false idols? What are the things that you are clinging to so desperately that you just can't let them go? Because to let them go would mean that you're stepping into something new. What are you so attached to that you think it is you? You think that without this thing, you wouldn't be you. The invitation at Passover is to sit with all of this. What is narrowing me? What am I connected and attached to in such a degree that even when I know it's for my greater good, I still resist? I still want to hold on to it and cling to it and call it up again and again and again. So the Passover story, so eventually, right, I'm going to give you the ending. Eventually, the Israelites, the entirely new generation, are able to enter the promised land. But Moses cannot, because Moses is still part of that old consciousness. Einstein says we can't solve a problem from the same consciousness that created it. So Moses was the consciousness that was more elevated than this enslavement. But now that the enslavement is over, there's an entirely new level of consciousness that is trying to emerge. And I would call that our Christ consciousness. That's the next iteration of what is seeking to show up within ourselves. So the story of Passover highlights sort of three ways of thinking. Magical thinking, which is it'll all going to work out somehow. But somehow, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's all going to kind of work out. It'll just, whatever works out will be what's supposed to work out. How many times do we say that? That's a little bit like the Israelites saying, God, just make it okay for us. Whatever God wants, I will have. Pick up your staff and divide the sea. That's what we're actually being invited into. The other place is habitual thinking, and that's where it will never change. It will never be different. And because whatever it is, will never be different, then I'm just going to keep coming back to it over and over and over again, because at least I know the edges of it. At least I know how to survive in it. And what this story is inviting us all into is miracle thinking. The idea that we have the capacity to be able to raise the staff that is the I am that we each are, and divide whatever the sea is for you. Whatever it is that you think you can't get on the other side of it because it's too big, it's too deep, it's too strong, it's too much. You are being invited to anchor miracle thinking. That as you stand in the I am, that anything is possible. And so how do we actually allow ourselves to be, I'm going to come back to a practice of forgiveness. We have to be able to forgive the Israelite parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that struggle, the parts of ourselves that can't quite keep up, the parts of ourselves that want to keep pulling us back into an old way of being. We need to meet those and hold them with love, with compassion, not anger, not resentment, not punishment. We need to welcome those parts of us into the experience of the burning bush. I always think of the burning bush as being my heart alit with fire of my I amness. And what if I invite those parts of myself that feel so separate, so alone? What if I invited them in to that heart space? Because until we are willing to let go of the resentments and the anger and all of those things, we are destined to continue to be stuck in habitual thinking. That is what will keep happening again and again and again, because what you grow in your own consciousness is what you will experience. So if you are growing resentment, if you are growing anger and frustration, if that is where you are placing your own attention, turning that inward, then that's not a process of healing. And that's what this teaching is all about. I love this idea that without forgiveness, we sow life amidst the thorns of our resentments, judgments, and seeming failures. What if we could hold all of that in the burning bush that is our heart? What if we could bring all of this into the very center of the truth of who we are? And then no part of us would need to be outside the promised land. The promised land is right now. The promised land is not tomorrow. The promised land is not some distant future. The promised land is not an actual geographic location. The promised land is a space and place in consciousness that we cultivate daily, minute by minute. And that is what is inviting us to become more conscious, more awake, and more aware. So are you willing to step out of the Mitzrayim, the narrow space that is your world? Tim's ready. Anybody else want to join him? Right? Are you willing to release the false idols? The things that you are clinging to, that you think are so important in your life, but they're really just vestiges. They're like the after image of a life that you used to live, that you're trying to keep living into. Are you willing to let those go? Are you willing to say yes to the burning bush that is your heart? So let's do these as some affirmations. I am willing to move through my Mitzrayim.
I am willing to move through my Mitzrayim.
Let's say that word again, Mitzrayim.
Mitzrayim.
It's a good word, isn't it? Right? It's a Mitzrayim. And also the imagery of moving through the Red Sea is like a birth canal, right? The actual rebirth through the salt waters into a new beingness. That's Mitzrayim as well. It gets used in birth imagery as well, right? So that piece. And I am willing to release my false idols.
I am willing to release my false idols.
And I am willing to let the burning bush of my heart glow brightly.
And I am willing to let the burning bush of my heart glow brightly.
I am willing to be the I am.
I am willing to be the I am.
And so it is.
So it is.
Amen.